Okay, this presentation this morning it really has two parts. We're going to be dealing with elections. I'm not sure we're going to get to campaigns. The first part is standard American government intro fare. It's been taught for decades, and it's still useful and important. The second part is going to be painful to some of you, maybe to many of you, and it represents changes in the American electoral process that are very recent, and there is every likelihood that some of you will think that the second part of the presentation is politically biased. I will tell you that the sources that I used are nonpartisan and involve research done not only by political scientists, but also by the Justice Department, by the Government Accountability Office, which is a nonpartisan agency in the Congress, and by nonpartisan human rights and civil rights groups. And I invite you to, especially if you think that I am not telling the whole story, I would strongly urge you to do your own research from reliable sources, and then you can come to your own conclusions. You should do that anyway. You shouldn't take anything any professor says blindly. So, I want to start today by talking about election types and the election calendar. We elect presidents, as I imagine you know, every 4 years. Presidential elections occur the actual voting day, I think the first Tuesday of November every 4 years, so 2012, 2016, 2020, and so on. And at that time, there are also elections for all of the members of the House of Representatives and roughly a third of the members of the United States Senate, and a good number of gubernatorial elections in various states. So those are presidential election years. Then there's what we call off-year or midterm elections, which we're going to have, which we're in the process of right now. Off-year or midterm elections are when the presidency is not up for election, but again, all of the members of the House of Representatives are running for office, and a third of the members of the Senate, and some gubernatorial elections. So that midterm or off-year elections occur in 2010, 2014, 2018, 2022, etc. These are elections that do not coincide with the election of the president. We call the November elections the general election, and this, whether it's midterm or presidential, and this is when the largest percentage of people vote. And then there are primary, special, or other elections, which usually occur sometime prior to November, usually in April, May, maybe early June, maybe even earlier than April. One of the key things to understand about elections and election outcomes is that every election has a different electorate. Every election has a different electorate, and this is why turnout is so critical. One of the things, parenthetically, I know it's common wisdom for many Americans to say that candidates for office lie all the time. I don't think it makes much sense to try to understand the world as a whole or politics based on the presumption of the bad faith of other people. I think that's a really poor way to live your life. It's also, I think, largely incorrect. One reason politicians say different things is because they are speaking to different audiences and running in different elections. And so politicians are smart enough to know that they need, most of them anyway, need to try to craft their message. That's different from lying. They need to try to emphasize those words, those issues, those symbols that mean more to the people who they're speaking with. Just as an example, it's a stupid example, but I'll give it anyway. If somebody's running for president and they're up in Montana, which is highly unlikely because there are so few electoral votes, but let's assume that somebody who's running for president is up in Montana, it's really unlikely that they're going to be talking about the blockade of Cuba that's gone on for many decades, because there are probably only a handful of Cuban Americans in Montana. In Florida, there are many, many, many Cuban Americans. If a candidate didn't speak to that issue in Florida, his team or her team were not doing a good job. So that's not lying. Candidates have to pay attention to their audience and to who the electorate is. So we started out, we talked about the general election and the off-year election, or to use this chart's terms, the presidential elections and the midterm elections. And these are different elections. One election, the president's elected and is on the ballot, and another one, the president is not. So let's take a look at what this chart tells us. The concept that political scientists have identified is, to in part explain American elections, is surge and decline. So what this chart does is look at the percentage of the population that's eligible to vote that actually votes. And what you see is that year after year, election after election, the turnout in presidential election years, 2012, 2016, 2020, exceeds significantly, in most cases, the turnout for the midterm elections. The electorate is different. The electorate is larger. Okay? But it's not a random distribution of the population that doesn't vote in, see down here for the midterm elections, it's usually, the turnout is usually around 40%, maybe slightly higher. It's closer to 60%, 55 to 60% for presidential election years. The people who are voting in the presidential elections but not in the midterm elections are not randomly distributed. So, in presidential election years, if you take a look at that bell curve that you drew on the board, the conventional wisdom to explain presidential election politics is as follows. The folks who are partisan identifiers, that is, they think of themselves as Republicans or Democrats, are usually going to vote for the presidential candidate who is a Republican or a Democrat, depending on their party ID. That leaves a somewhat larger group of people in the middle between those two vertical lines who are independents or who have very, very, very weak party affiliations or identification. And in fact, there are more people, we already saw this from an earlier image last time, there are more people in most states who are independents than are Republicans, and there are more independents often than there are Democrats. So the independents represent a plurality of the electorate in general, though by no means a majority. So, if you wish to understand presidential elections, what you've got is a competition largely, not only, but to in some significant manner, for the votes of the independents, those between the two vertical lines. They're not party identifiers. Okay? They tend to be independent. They tend to split their ticket when they vote. Why do they vote in presidential elections? They vote in presidential elections for a number of reasons. One might be civic duty, another might be just because the coverage is so intense. It's so available to almost all American citizens. And so independents are most likely to vote in presidential election years. And many times, not only do the two candidates and the two parties compete for the independent vote, but it's not uncommon that the independent vote actually determines the way it divides between the parties and the two parties' presidential candidates. That often determines, not always, but often determines, I would argue usually determines, which candidate is going to win. Do you have questions at this point? Okay. So what happens in off-year elections? Well, they're not as sexy. They're not covered as much. There's no one-on-one between two candidates, one for each party. And so voter participation declines. Okay? The surge is in presidential election years when more people vote. More independents vote. People who are most likely to vote, among other things, we've already determined, are people who have a strong party identification with Party A or Party B. The weaker the party ID, all other things equal, the lower participation rate there's going to be in an off-year or a midterm election. So what happens? There's a decline in turnout. There's a decline in voter participation between the presidential election year, which was 2012 most recently, and 2014, which is right now. And so based on this chart, we can expect that turnout nationally will probably be in the range of 40% plus or minus in the off-year elections. But as I said, the decline in participation is not random. Who is less likely to vote? The folks who are less likely to vote, all things equal, are those with a weaker or non-existent party identification, less ideological, less interested in politics. Okay? And so the outcome of midterm elections tends to reflect, first, this drop in voter participation, and secondly, tends to revert to the existing partisan divide in a state and in its congressional districts. What am I saying here? Well, what I'm saying is, if you take a good chunk of the independents who may well have swung the outcome of the presidential election out of the turnout for the off-year election, what remains are the party identifiers, the D's and the R's, and the division between D and R in its state or in a congressional district is more likely to determine the outcome of midterm elections. What does this mean? Broadly, what it means is, in a presidential, and you got to be very careful with this, but in presidential election years, the party of the winning candidate, often the winning presidential candidate, often pulls a few congressional candidates of his party or her party and state and local candidates in his or her party along for the win, because more people voted for the winning presidential candidate. That's referred to as presidential coattails. Sometimes winning presidential candidates don't have coattails. Sometimes they're limited. Often they're limited. And it depends in part in how partisan the candidate is when he's running for president. But so what happens then if let's say take 2012 where the Democrat won the presidential election, a few more Democrats got elected with President Obama because more people voted for President Obama. Now, and he won the independents. Now many of those independents drop out in off-year elections, and as a result, the common expectation, no matter which party wins the White House, is that after a presidential election, the midterm election usually involves some degree of gain in congressional seats for the opposition party. Doesn't matter whether it's a Republican who's been elected president or a Democrat. What matters is a greater percentage of independents drop out, don't vote in off-year elections, and so the surge that elected the president evaporates in the off-year election, and as a result, the other party tends to gain some number of seats in the Congress the following off-year election. Does this make sense to you, and am I being clear?
Yeah.
So this is a structural feature of presidential elections and off-year elections that has nothing to do with the personality of the president. It may be the case that if the president is widely hated or widely liked, that the gains of the out of power party will be greater in the first case and lower in the second. But there are a lot of other factors that play into this as well, and so you can't assume that. One of the factors, for example, is how the congressional districts have been created in terms of partisan division. Another is which Senate seats are up, and so on. Any comments or questions? One of the things that's important about this is this image is that this is a consistent pattern, not just over 2 or 3 years, but over multiple decades. And so if you don't understand this about elections in the United States, you don't understand very much, at least national elections. So, turnout is everything. Turnout is everything, and the difference, and obviously not only is turnout everything, but which part of the electorate turns out is what matters. So turnout peaks in presidential election years. Usually that influences to some degree state and local races. That's the coattails that we talk about. What's the effect of low voter turnout? The effect is that when it is low, it tends to revert to whatever partisan division in the electorate that exists within a congressional district, a state, or for that matter, the nation. Okay, so that is the conventional political sciencey stuff that you need to understand about off-year and presidential elections. I would say to you two other things about this. One is that elections are increasingly nationalized, in part because of the media, in part because you can give money, anybody can give money to a candidate anywhere in the country. Hang on one second, I want to look at something that just happened in the news that's relevant to this. Just give me 1 second. Okay, I just needed to get the facts right. So this week, for example, one of the most important gubernatorial elections is in Wisconsin, where Governor Scott Walker is up for re-election. He is being challenged by a woman Democratic candidate who has a very good chance of winning, and Walker already barely survived a recall vote, I think last year. The election is close. He may lose. Sheldon Adelson, who's a gaming, has a fortune in the gaming industry, just wrote a check for, he lives in Nevada probably, or at least his business is largely in Nevada, or substantially in Nevada. He wrote a check to Scott Walker for $650,000 this week. This is an example of the nationalization of American politics and of American electoral politics. Whether the money will make a difference, I have no way to know. But again, 50 years ago, this just never happened. 40 years, 30 years ago, this just never happened. And so both the nationalization of state and local elections, as well as the national flow of money, changes the electoral process in ways we're just beginning to understand. Something just as important, and probably if you're a Republican, the rest of this is going to be pretty painful. But you can check me. And I know that Indiana is primarily a Republican state. I know Ohio, which is where I live, is about 50-50. But as they say on the street, it is what it is. So do your own research from reliable and nonpartisan sources and see what you think. The United States has had a history, a tradition of the slow expansion of voting rights to those who were previously excluded. If you talk to women, they're certainly going to say it was slow because women have not even been allowed to vote nationally for not even 100 years yet. Not even 100 years. Most of our history, women couldn't vote nationally. There are individual states that allowed women to vote earlier than when the constitutional amendment was passed that allows for women to vote. But by and large, nationally, women couldn't vote until really around 1920. That's been our tradition. But for the past 4 years, the tradition has been under attack. The idea that more voting strengthens our democracy is under attack. And it's under attack all over the country, state by state, in many different ways. And this is a map of states with new voting restrictions since the 2010 election. And if you, first of all, if you superimpose one of our earlier maps of the outcome of the 2012 election, the states that are in the red went largely for Republican presidential candidate Romney, and the ones that are not in the red were more likely to support the incumbent Barack Obama. So this is the background. In the southern states, early voting by African Americans nearly tripled between 2004 and 2008. Why did that happen? First of all, the laws allowed for early voting. Early voting is not uncommon in many states. I'm going to vote tomorrow in downtown Cincinnati. But very clearly, one of the things that led to the tremendous increase in African Americans voting was there was a black guy running for president. Okay, this is perfectly normal in the history of American political life. When an ethnic group gets one of their own in the political limelight, they tend to support him or her. So when early voting was successful among minorities and lower-income voters, it became a target. In the last 3 years, 8 states with recent increases in minority early voting sharply cut back on early voting hours and days. And the days that were cut back were the days that were most convenient for low-income people, minorities, and hourly workers, like Sundays and evenings. Before 2011, only 2 states in the entire country required voters to show government-issued photo IDs at the polls. In the last 3 years, 9 states have passed strict new ID laws. Some accept state-issued student IDs, while others do not. Texas, for example, if you're a student at the University of Texas State University, your student ID will get you nothing. It will not allow you to vote. If you have a state hunting license, it will. If you're a woman and you got married and your driver's license has your maiden name on it, but now you're registered under, your driver's license has your married name on it, but when you initially registered, your maiden name is on the rolls, you're not allowed to vote. 4 more states have passed somewhat less restrictive ID requirements. Nationally, 11% of Americans do not have the state-issued photo IDs that are required under the stricter laws. That's a lot of people who all of a sudden have to come up with voter IDs. I'm going to tell you a story about that in a minute. Then there are voter registration restrictions that are new. 10 states have passed laws making it harder for citizens to register to vote, making it harder to conduct voter registration drives, making it a requirement that you provide documentary proof of citizenship when registering. Laws eliminating same-day registration, a law making it harder for people who move to stay registered. Voter registration problems have long been a barrier to voting, and in fact, 1/4 of eligible Americans are not even registered to vote, and millions more have outdated registrations. So, why have we got these new laws? Well, the proponents in the states of these laws have said we need to legislate new voting restrictions to prevent voter fraud. But there have been objective, nonpartisan studies that I'm going to present to you about voter fraud, and to not to put too fine a point on it, that argument doesn't hold water. President created a bipartisan presidential commission on election administration. It found that voter fraud is rare and mostly occurs by absentee ballot. A direct quote from that study: fraud is rare, but when it does occur, absentee ballots are often the method of choice. And it proposed expanding, the commission proposed expanding access to early voting as a measure to ease long lines at the polls that were existent in 2012. Other studies show that fraud occurs but is extremely uncommon. A Justice Department study found that between 2002 and 2005, 40 voters out of 197 million votes for federal candidates were indicted for voter fraud, and 26 resulted in convictions or guilty pleas. 26 voters out of 197 million. Four senators this year asked the research arm of Congress, which is a nonpartisan research arm, the GAO, to investigate what they called an alarming number of new state laws that made it significantly harder for millions of voters to vote. The GAO found little, if any, evidence of voter fraud. It calculated that the direct cost to would-be voters in the 17 states where voters need to present a driver's license or other state ID at polling places ranges from $14.50 in Indiana to $58.50 in Rhode Island. The cost of getting a birth certificate needed to obtain a non-driver ID. Remember, some people don't drive, especially older people, and I suppose it's possible some younger people still don't drive. Cost from $7 in North Dakota to $25 in Georgia. Well, let me tell you something. I lost my birth certificate. I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked. This happened about 2 years ago. I've been looking for 2 years. Finally, I bit the bullet and I ordered 2 copies from the state of Michigan of my birth certificate. The cost to me was $73. $73. That's a lot of money for a lot of people. Focusing on 2 states with strict ID laws, Kansas and Tennessee, the GAO found that there were greater fall-offs in voter turnout in states that had restrictive voting laws. The 2012 general election turnout compared to 2008 was as much as 3.2% less in Kansas and 2.2% less in Tennessee than in other states. Fall-off was greatest among African Americans, young people, and newly registered voters. 3.2 or 2.2 may not sound like very much, but keep in mind it's like 3.2% of a million, or at least a very large number, and sometimes many more than a million. So this year, voters in 22 states face new voting restrictions. The question that I want to raise, I need to raise with you, is whether this is a partisan election strategy. My view is that these laws are not about fraud, but about voting suppression, about rolling back the slow but continuing gains which have allowed more and more American citizens to vote. And there's research that supports this argument. These changes were, first of all, were the work of legislative majorities that swept into office in 2010. Partisanship plays a key role. 18 of the 22 states with new restrictions were passed by entirely Republican-controlled legislative bodies. 2 political scientists did a study. They found that restrictions were more likely to pass as the proportion of Republicans in the legislature increased or when a Republican governor was elected. They also found that racism was a factor. In 2008, voter participation among African Americans and other groups surged. The more states saw increases in minority and low-income voter turnout, the more likely it was to push laws restricting voting rights. That's what the 2 political scientists found. The Brennan Center for Justice found that 11 of the states with the highest African American turnout In 2008, 7 of the 11 passed laws making it harder to vote. Of the 12 states with the largest Hispanic population growth in the 2010 census, 9 or 75% have new restrictions. Of the 15 states that used to be monitored closely under the Voting Rights Act because of a history of racial discrimination in elections, 9 or 60% passed new restrictions. So from my point of view, I would say that this is pretty disturbing. It's, from my point of view, an attack on democratic small d, not big D, elections themselves. Another wrinkle in this is an interesting one that has, I think, obvious racial overtones. And that is states have, and this is not so new, states have been doing this for a long time. Some states are denying convicted felons the right to vote. You might say, well, all right, so what's wrong with that? Well, Florida, Iowa, and South Dakota all made it significantly harder for Americans with criminal convictions to have voting rights restored. In Florida and Iowa, these citizens are permanently disenfranchised. Note that nothing in the law that they violated said that they would lose their right to vote. This is separate laws that are passed. About 6 million Americans who have done their time have lost the right to vote. 1.5 million of them are in Florida. Overall, 7.7% of all African Americans have lost their right to vote, compared to 1.8% of whites. And this, in my judgment, is directly linked to the police and criminal justice system to discriminate in clear and visible, long, historic ways against African Americans. Breaking this week, for example, is a study of police arrest behavior in Minnesota, which shows clear and obvious racial disparities. The case of Ferguson, Missouri, of course, is another, poster child for this. What you can't argue against is the brute fact that there is racial disparity in the criminal justice system. I might also note that these kinds of laws discriminate heavily against younger people who are more likely to be involved in one manner or another, we'll say, with smoking marijuana. Probably there are a lot percentage-wise more 20-year-olds who have smoked marijuana than 50-year-olds. And 50-year-olds are much likely to get arrested than 20-year-olds. Some specific states with new voting restrictions in the Midwest. Ohio passed a law that said the chief state election official can only mail unsolicited absentee ballots if the legislature provides funding. Also passed a law that says persons who don't have an ID or a Social Security number can't vote, and the state reduced early voting, and same-day registration was eliminated. Both Wisconsin and Ohio reduced early voting periods, and there have been a flurry of recent federal court decisions on these state laws that restrict voting. One that threw out the state of Wisconsin's restrictions on voting, new laws, and another which approved the restrictions in Texas. So this is a summary of voter ID laws. First, photo ID laws. At least 18 states have recently introduced bills requiring voters to show a photo ID or making existing photo ID laws more restrictive. 4 have introduced bills requiring proof of citizenship, such as a birth certificate to register to vote. Just raise your hand if you are in possession of your birth certificate and know where it is. How many people raising their hands?
Most everybody.
Pardon?
Most all of them.
Oh, you know where they are? Good for you. Okay. These laws also make voter registration harder. At least 13 states have introduced bills to limit voter registration mobilization efforts. 4 have reduced early voting opportunities. At least 2 states have made it harder for students to register and vote. The governor of Maine has said no student in a college or university should be allowed to vote if they're originally from out of state, even if they're in the state of Maine most of or all of the year. 7 states have sought to reduce access to absentee ballots. At least 2 states that I'm aware of, Florida and Iowa, have sought to purge hundreds of thousands of voters from the rolls. The article at the bottom of the slide projects that as many as, in Indiana, as many as 700,000 voters could be moved to the inactive list and might be purged from the voter rolls. There's demonstrations and sit-ins right now in Georgia because the election officials there have somehow lost 40,000 new registrations to vote, and they can't explain where they went to, and those 40,000 people may not be able to vote. In fact, probably won't be able to vote unless either they find them or something else happens. So, it's important to remember our history. It's not as though everybody had the right to vote in this country. When the country first ratified the Constitution, a very, very slim minority had voting rights. Indians, Native Americans, were not even citizens. They had no legal rights. Blacks were not citizens of the United States. Women were citizens, but citizens without any, with few, if any, political rights, certainly not the right to vote. And many white men without property were unable to vote. And people under 21 were not able to vote. In addition, we know that many of the southern states passed Jim Crow laws. What were they designed to do? Stop black people from voting. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clause, white primary. The Constitution of the United States has an amendment that prohibits poll taxes. If somebody has to spend $50 or $25 to get an ID, for my money, friends, that is a poll tax. If a state passes a law that says you need to do something that will necessarily cost you money as a prerequisite from voting, I don't care whether it's walking around the block, getting a state ID, a driver's license, or whatever. That's a poll tax. That's constitutionally prohibited. The courts have not yet agreed with me. A quote from a woman in Texas, the case of Texas 2014. She says, "We're reliving the Jim Crow era in the United States and nowhere more so than Texas. Ever since we became a majority-minority state," in other words, the number of Caucasians was less than 50%. In 2004, Republicans have passed law after law to stem the tide of demographically wrought political change. And so the new laws have dismantled minority voting districts, cut education funds, closed down abortion facilities, and so on. The disproportionately disadvantaged low-income and minority residents of the state. And this really reflects the broader societal context. We have many more Hispanics than we did 30 or 40 years ago. The number of black people in the population remains relatively constant, but there are more minorities. There are more people from Asia coming to the United States, and we can expect, based on what we know about individual and family behavior, we have every reason to expect, for a number of reasons, and this isn't just in the United States, but it's around the world and throughout human history, that lower income people will tend to have more children. You know, for somebody who's as wealthy as I am, children actually cost me money. If I don't have any money, if I have 10 kids, I can send them all out to work and they can make money. And maybe one of them will hit the jackpot and help the rest of us. So higher birth rates are common across cultures and societies. We are out of time, and we are on slide 36, and we will pick up this as a perfect stopping point, and we will talk about campaigns tomorrow.